tyranny is trying to tread into somebody's mind, to distort it and deform it to reflect what you think is good.
Is critical race theory fundamentally at odds with freedom of speech?
When the identity politics regime says that certain kinds of speech are harmful or should not be said, what they're saying is that your mind should belong to me as a person in a marginalized group. Your inner thoughts should reflect my views of my own self-respect.
Is there any situation in which the criminalization of speech is justified? To dig deeper into the ideological battle surrounding policing of speech, I decided to sit down with Arthur Millick, Executive Director of the Claremont Institute's Center for the American Way of Life. Back in May of 2020, he wrote the prescient report, Hate Speech and the New Tyranny of the Mind, for the Heritage Foundation. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. And as you may know, YouTube has demonetized this channel. To stay connected, please make sure you subscribe to our mailing list in the description below so you never miss an episode. Arthur Millick, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you very much for having me.
Arthur, the Center for the American Way of Life, a centerpiece of the American way of life actually has been free speech. Free speech is something that's, I guess, becoming in a bit of a question for Americans. It certainly is in my home country of Canada. In the 80s and 90s, there was this notion of political correctness. You knew that there were certain things you shouldn't talk about or weren't really talked about in polite company. Today, all of that seems to be on overdrive, in a manner of speaking. So tell me, what's going on here?
Sure. Well, you're right that in the 80s and 90s, political correctness was a kind of social pressure exerted on the American public, which constrained the things one could say and think in polite society. But that has greatly progressed, and it has progressed because the doctrines beneath it have become more and more radical, and because the tools to suppress that kind of speech have also expanded in their power. In the 80s and 90s, there was no Google, for example, that controlled 90% or so of the internet's, or of the world's internet searches. Today, Google has an identity politics doctrine beneath its speech codes that aims to restrict the kinds of information that can be found, and therefore the kinds of thoughts that can be thought. Moreover, there is great progress in the radicalness of the doctrine. In other words, in the 90s, it had a lot to do with politeness. You shouldn't say this because it'll hurt people's feelings. But today, there's an entire doctrinal world beneath controlling so-called hate speech. And it can basically be summarized in somewhat of a crude way in this regard, that it has to do with silencing the thoughts and speech of the so-called oppressor group so as to increase and free the speech of the so-called marginalized. And these two groups are in conflict, as the theorists of this claim. And so what must happen is there must be less speech from the oppressor group and more speech from the marginalized. And so hate speech laws or hate speech policies in companies are really about silencing the opinions and thoughts of the so-called oppressor group.
Okay, that's super interesting. I mean, one thing that we've been hearing a lot about lately is critical race theory, how it's being taught in the workplace, in the federal government. There was an executive order recently to prevent that from happening that was rescinded. We hear the idea that equity is a very important principle that's being pushed towards equity, not equality. There's a distinction. Hopefully you'll explain that distinction to me as well later. But so how does critical race theory, which is the thing that most people are aware of, fit into this?
Right. Well, there are a lot of people, mainly I think on the right, who say, well, this nation would really benefit from some kind of religious reawakening. And what they often fail to see is that we're actually living through one right now. and it's called critical race theory, or let's say identity politics. It's an attempt to purify and purge the world of evil. And evil it defines as oppression, the lack of equity, as you said. And the way to do that is you have to use the laws, use speech, use pressure mechanisms to wrestle away the power and the self-respect, as they claim, of this oppressor group. And critical race theory is a kind of sophisticated, or I should say pseudo-sophisticated understanding that tries to teach, and in my view propagandize people by saying that all of history was oppression. There was nothing good whatsoever in the past. We right now are riding a wave of justice, and for it to blossom, to mix metaphors, for it to cover over the world with goodness, what must be done is the rational faculty of either oppressor groups or their sympathizers must be washed clean by showing them that they are really evil, they are unconscious beneficiaries of all sorts of privileges, and that they therefore should remain silent when told what justice is. They should remain silent when they are told, well, you don't belong in this classroom or in this dormitory. That is its goal, in my view.
So, and something that's very interesting in this also is that it's very much about group identity, not individual identity. How does that fit in?
Well, it does organize the world into groups, but in this, as I said, rather crude way, that there is pure evil and then there is pure goodness. And it's the marginalized that are pure, and they don't shy away from saying this. It's white Americans. This is all over their literature. It's almost being said publicly by politicians now, that contain evil. Now, one, I think, very important thing to understand is what are the implications of this kind of morality, this kind of metaphysic? And in my view, there are two rather shocking conclusions: that the marginalized are both morally and intellectually superior to their oppressors. They are morally superior because the oppressor group is fundamentally distorted by its powers, by its privilege, by its institutions, and therefore cannot hear the just pleas or cries of the marginalized. But the marginalized, even though they claim to be oppressed and distorted by all of these things, nonetheless understand justice, understand who deserves what, in a way that the oppressor simply cannot. The second regard is the claim that they are intellectually superior too. They're intellectually superior because they can understand all of these quote-unquote white superstructures. They can understand the nature of privilege. They can understand the legal system on which America is founded and say that it is racist, it is unjust, it is evil. While on the other hand, when the supposed oppressor tries to understand their culture, for example, their perspective, that is called appropriation. That is called not being able to grasp, but demanding that you merely sympathize because you cannot understand fundamentally this plight.
In your recent op-ed that you did in the Epoch Times, it's actually titled Freedom of Speech versus Identity Politics. And you make this, obvious stark juxtaposition. Why are these two juxtaposed so tightly?
Right. Well, maybe the way to get into that is to talk a little bit about why we have the freedom of speech at all. There are three reasons why we have the freedom of speech. The first one, I think, is more or less obvious to all of us as having some experience of political liberty, which is that if you're going to be a free people that rules yourself, you have to have the freedom of speech so as to deliberate on matters that concern your local community, your state, and ultimately the nation. You have to be able to speak these things out with your representatives. That's one. That's an obvious one. But the two others, I think, are less obvious and more interesting in a way. The second is that the freedom of speech has to do with what the tradition, the intellectual tradition upon which this nation was founding, thought was the highest human good, which is the search for the truth. In other words, to search for the truth, you have to have a freedom of mind. And you search for that truth in philosophy, religion, and science. Now, this requires an important caveat, which is that the freedom of speech is a right because your mind belongs to you. And because your mind belongs to you, your speech therefore belongs to you. And when the identity politics regime says that certain kinds of speech are harmful or should not be said, to somewhat radicalize that view, what they're saying is that your mind should belong to me as a person in a marginalized group. Your thoughts, your inner thoughts, should reflect my views of my own self-respect, which is something that the founders thought could happen, such a demand, but they thought that there is an absolute wall whereby your mind, your reason, your opinions, and your conscience belong to you. So that, because tyranny is trying to tread into somebody's mind, to distort it and deform it to reflect what you think is good. The third reason, this is, I think, the one that is least understood today, regrettably, is that the freedom of speech develops a certain character in a people. And that character is one of reasonableness. And what I mean by that is that it means developing the capacity to both persuade people by making arguments to them, and simultaneously possess an openness of soul to being persuaded by rational arguments. That kind of disposition, that kind of character formation, took generations to develop and is actually a very rare thing. Sometimes you may see clips on YouTube or wherever of foreign parliaments where they come to fisticuffs because of some disagreement. And one could say that there the practice of the freedom of speech has not fully blossomed, has not fully developed. Because the opposite of me persuading you by reason is me forcing you, is me demanding that you believe me. And when you don't, I force you. So those are the three main reasons that the freedom of speech has been so powerfully important for us. And it's for those very reasons that the disappearance of the freedom of speech is so harmful. To take away political liberty, to take away this freedom of the mind, and to take away this capacity in us to be reasonable, to persuade and be persuaded, which is connected ultimately to our capacity to make political judgments too. You're practiced in reasoning, you're practiced in thinking about things, and that prevents a people from falling in love with the impossible, with impossible hopes, impossible revolutionary hopes. You see in America, radical thoughts spring up frequently in the public square, but then they're discussed and they become moderated. And if they're bad ideas, they usually go away. And that's the danger of restricting the freedom of speech, is that those radical ideas don't go away. They're actually ensconced in laws and institutions and ingrained. And nobody can provide any rational opposition, no matter how reasonable that opposition would be.